All right, so hey guys, we're going to be talking about Hitler Oversimplified Part 1, the infamous banned video by YouTube in 20 odd European countries. This video was not findable for me on YouTube because I live in Austria right now, so I had to go to Dailymotion and then I downloaded it, so that's why you'll be seeing it in VLC. Just to quickly comment on this video being banned, I think it's ridiculous. For one, obviously, Oversimplified is not, spewing out hate propaganda or hate speech or anything like this. But it's also important for us to educate ourselves not only about the war and the effects of it, but also the individuals who were the cause of it. Right, the main one being Adolf Hitler himself. I think a question that could be asked is, well, why study his childhood? Why is this important? But I think a lot of the times we sort of detach Hitler in being this sort of evil force, this evil entity, the evilness of the 20th century. And I think sometimes we forget that he was a human being, right? He was made of flesh and blood like you and I. He had dreams, he had fears, and it's important to sort of study where an individual like this came from and what they became, right? What were the steps into making a man who committed arguably the worst, certainly one of the worst atrocities of human history, right? And certainly of the 20th century. So that's just sort of my thoughts quickly on the ban, but let's not waste too much time on this, and let's get right into it.
Look at this baby. So gentle. So innocent. You'd think this child would grow up to become a good man. An honest man.
Nope.
Well, think again.
So one thing too is that, so this is actually, this is a photo of Adolf Hitler as a baby, but the Allies during the war, they actually published an alleged photo of baby Hitler, which was this sort of larger baby with this bigger head and everything like this. It wasn't the cutest baby, and they actually altered the photo to make it even uglier, so to say. And then they published, oh, look at how ugly Hitler was as a child. And obviously it was debunked. It was debunked afterwards, but yeah, so here's the minus the mustache, of course.
Hitler was born Adolphus Hitler in 1889 in a small town in Austria-Hungary. His father...
Yes, Braunau on him. That's actually not that far away from Vienna. And a good friend of mine, his girlfriend, her father is actually one of the is working in the sort of courts in Braunau, and right now there's a debate to what to do about the Hitler home, where Hitler was actually originally grew up in Braunau.
Alois Schicklgruber was born out of wedlock, but eventually changed his name to that of his stepfather, becoming Alois Hitler. Alois was a mid-level...
And even with Hitler, there's a few odd reasons where that surname came from. I believe it's Hitler as well is another one. I'm not entirely sure how Hitler was exactly settled upon, but there were a couple other surnames as well. Hütler, I think, and a couple other ones. So, though you got to think if he really stuck out with Adolf Schicklgruber, right? Would we be really there's a lot of power in a name. And Adolf Schicklgruber, being the one of the most evil men of the 20th century, just doesn't have quite the same ring.
Austrian customs officer, not really rolling in cash, but certainly rolling in women. He married a rich older lady, but then immediately started having affairs, including one with a much younger house servant. A few years later, he left his sick wife to be with his mistress, but since the Catholic Church didn't allow divorce at the time, he couldn't marry her. So he waited for his old wife to die and had a child in the meantime. Then his wife died, so he married his mistress and had another child, but then his new wife got sick, so he employed his much younger cousin Clara to take care of her. Then when his new wife died, he immediately got Clara, his cousin, pregnant. And
not a very nice guy, sort of moving around between women and whatnot. And so Hitler had quite a few, I suppose, step siblings in that way, and not. I don't know if he had any biological siblings, but we'll find out.
And married her in that order, you rock star. Clara and Alois had 3 children together, who all tragically died while in infancy. So when the 4th child, Adolf, came along, Clara spoiled him rotten. The Hitlers had 2 more kids, and the family moved around a few times, meaning Adolf had to attend 5 different elementary schools.
And Paula Hitler, too. Paula Hitler lived, I think, until the 70s or so. She actually lived quite late, and she was actually a lot out of the scene during the sort of Nazi regime. She was not involved politically or anything like that, and I think she lived long past the war. So, Society 101, nationalism and why it's so great.
Adolf's father was strict, quick to anger, and took most of it out on the eldest son until he had enough and ran away at the age of 14, leaving 7-year-old Adolf to do most of the chores and get berated by his father. The result was a difficult relationship with his dad, while he was super attached to his mother, who worried over him and his health excessively. Hitler did well in school at first. His grades were good and his teachers praised him. He was popular with the other kids and enjoyed gathering them together to play war games. He also loved reading and particularly liked stories about cowboys and Indians. As he grew older though, he started to get into trouble. He was caught smoking once, organized a raid on a local orchard, tormented his pro-Austria religion teacher with symbolic gestures, displaying his allegiance to the idea of united Germanic people under a greater German state in defiance of Habsburg Austria. You know, the usual.
Yeah, and that was sort of pan-nationalism, pan-Germanicism that was really sort of popular at the time. And I don't know if really an 8-year-old Hitler is sitting there having debates. However, later in his youth, especially during his teenage years, this was sort of the political ideology that he was influenced by. Though this was obviously not when he was 7 or anything, wearing the little spinny cap, but later in his youth.
All of this enraged Adolf's father, who punished him severely. The area of Austria-Hungary that Hitler lived in was once part of the German Confederation, and many of the people who lived there considered themselves to be German. Adolf tended to just go against whatever his father said, and since his father was an Austrian public official, Hitler got big into German nationalism. This enraged Adolf's father, who punished...
Right, and it wasn't even just German nationalism, but sort of pan-Germanism that was also along sort of ethnic lines and other things like this, right? You notice that in Czechoslovakia, what was to become Czechoslovakia, all a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? Those sort of regions were considered more German than Austrian. And also, his father was a customs official, and so he was about the most boring, bureaucratic, mid-level government job you could possibly have. So having your son being a pan-national German nationalist, probably obviously led to images like this, I guess.
Punished him severely. Around this time, a family tragedy struck. His 6-year-old brother, whom he loved a lot, died of measles when Adolf was 10, and was buried in the cemetery just across from their home. Around this time, neighbors reported a change in the young boy. Strange behaviors such as talking to trees and staying up late staring at the stars from the cemetery walls. He lost interest in religion, and his school grades started to decline, which enraged his father, who punished him severely. It also didn't help that he had just entered high school, and the cool city boys treated him like a rural peasant. He had to repeat a grade and had little interest in most school subjects, instead spending his time reading and drawing, which he was quite good at. One day
And that was one other thing too that sort of came out in Hitler later, especially during the end of the war, is that he was very aloof. He was very hard to get contact with. He was never very hardworking either. And so, for example, you read about some presidents, for example, Roosevelt or Truman, that were working 12 to 16-hour days, right? Lyndon B. Johnson, one of the most famous presidents for his insane working schedule, sometimes working 20 hours a day, sleeping 4 hours, nearly working constantly. Whereas Hitler was not a very hard worker. He was very aloof. He was very, sort of, what would you say, almost bohemian in some sort of manner. And especially near the end of the war, where he would get up at 11, he would have lunch, he would maybe work for 2 hours, and then he would go and do dog training with his dog Blondie, and other things, sort of tasks that were not fitting of a leader who was in the midst of a worldwide war, right? And there's a famous sort of anecdote about the agricultural minister who had tried to receive a meeting with Hitler for 5 years during the war, and I think he never got it, or he got it in something like late 1944. It took him 5 years to get a meeting, and because of the way that the German government was structured, so many things had to go through Hitler that he just sort of gave to his subordinates, so then they could fight it out amongst each other, which led to obvious power struggles, right? For example, through Göring and Bormann and other things like this. So kind of interesting how you can see this sort of aloofness, right? This sort of bohemian type, lack of hard work and discipline, whether that's due to his brother dying or not. how that sort of carries through into his older age. And I mean, at the end of the day, it affected world history. Right, so
Father said, "Son, someday you'll be a big balls public official like me." And Adolf replied, "No, father, I'm going to become an artist and soar high above the clouds with the eagles." This enraged his father, but by this time he was an old-ass man, so he just sort of let it go, and then died of a lung hemorrhage. Hitler just about passed his final semester and celebrated in the typical way by getting blackout drunk and wiping his ass with the certificate. However, he didn't take the overall final
that I did not know.
Exam, instead just dropping out. The now 16-year-old boy was unemployed, without much purpose in life, and for the next 3 years, he stayed that way. He spent most of his time at the opera with his only friend, August Kubizek.
And the other thing too is that while he was spending his time with August, is that he was actually lying, saying he was going to school, but he was just taking the money and sort of just walking around Linz, right, and just sort of living, like I said, the sort of bohemian, carefree kind of lifestyle. So yeah.
Kubizek later wrote his memories of the young Hitler and said he was passionately interested in many things, felt he was in many ways better than others his age, was quick to anger just like his father, and an incredible speaker once he was ranting. When he was 18, he said a very sad goodbye to his mother and went to Vienna to take the entrance exam for art school. He failed. Soon after, he had to return home. His mother was sick, and her health was rapidly deteriorating. Hitler stayed by her side, and when she eventually died, the family doctor said he had never seen someone so overwhelmed with grief as Hitler was.
And this doctor, I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was actually Jewish. And he was sort of pardoned, in a way, by Hitler, calling him an honorary Aryan for trying to save his mother's life later in time when he became the Chancellor of Germany, right? And so there's little moments like this where you think, clearly there is some form of empathy within Adolf Hitler, but just what it was directed to was incredibly confusing and driven by fear and hate and ideology. And so
then Hitler returned to Vienna, still hoping to find a career in the arts, but he never did. Instead, without parental support, Hitler ended up on the streets. Now in his
right, and sort of this was the period too where he was just living off his stipends from lying about going to school. I believe it was stipends from his aunt or from his cousin, and just sort of doing really nothing during this overall period in his life. And just to talk about his friend Kubizek and whatnot, Kubizek was a bit of a quiet individual as well. He really enjoyed to sort of listen. He was not very active, and he really bonded with Hitler, because Hitler was really big into sort of being the ranting about architecture and nationalism and aerodynamics and science and other things like this. And Kubizek was always there to sort of listen to him and just sort of be like, oh, okay, yeah. So Hitler, in a way, had his first rally, if you will, with an audience of one during this friendship that he had with Kubizek. And sorry if I'm mispronouncing
early 20s, he spent a few rough years living in and out of homeless shelters, making what little he could from selling postcards he painted. It's hard to...
And he used to hang out at the Café Central, which is in Vienna, which, fun fact, is also where Trotsky and Freud and Tito used to frequent as well. So, there's an interesting idea of what if at one time someone like Trotsky and Hitler were in the same cafe. We don't know. They actually didn't live too far away from each other. And so maybe one day I would do a video in Vienna about these sort of places where world leaders used to sort of future world leaders used to hang out.
Pinpoint exactly when and how Hitler's extreme ideological beliefs formed, but his time in Vienna would have certainly played a role.
Definitely.
Anti-Semitism was widespread in the city. The mayor, whom Hitler supported, was an outspoken anti-Semite. There were many right-wing anti-Semitic newsletters, which Hitler took a keen interest in. He bought into the conspiracy theories and became a firm believer in the idea that there are many races in constant struggle with one another, the purest of which were the German Aryan people, and the worst of which, he believed, were Jews.
Yes.
Since Austria-Hungary was a multi-ethnic empire full of lesser races, Hitler wasn't a fan. So when he was 24, he moved to Munich in Germany to avoid doing military service. And for one more year, he was a drifter on the streets, until something huge happened. In 1914, long-standing tensions in Europe erupted into the First World War. Crowds across Europe celebrated the news. Within days, Hitler volunteered for the German army. The war gave him a purpose in life. His fellow soldiers...
And not only that, so technically he didn't just volunteer for the German army, but he was actually asked specifically to join the German army and not the Austrian army, which is what he should have joined, being an Austrian citizen. However, due to some unknown reason that I believe is still not clear to this day, whether it was a clerical error or something like this, he was allowed to join the German army despite being an Austrian citizen. So, this clerical error, this whatnot, allegedly, I think it was the King of Bavaria. Allegedly, the King of Bavaria was the one who accepted his plea to join the German army. However, this is most likely a myth and never happened. But yeah, so he didn't just volunteer. It was a bit more complicated than that.
This gave him friendship and brotherhood. Despite the horrors of war, Hitler considered it to be the best time of his life. He was reportedly a brave soldier and was awarded the Iron Cross, first class. He was also very lucky and had many close encounters with death. His luck ran out in 1960.
So not only, I just want to highlight on that. So the close encounter, there's a famous story of he went, him and his friends his comrades were sitting in a trench just having lunch or something like this, and he went to go use the bathroom. And as soon as he went to go use the bathroom, an artillery barrage began, and it killed nearly every single one of his friends that was sitting there. So he avoided death on multiple occasions, right? And you just got to think, the little thing in your head that's like, man, if Hitler didn't have to pee at that time, what would have happened, right? But there's a really great video by Mark Felton that I would recommend. That was Hitler the Soldier. As much as we can say about Hitler, obviously being the committer of one of the worst crimes of the 20th century, he was an incredibly brave soldier in World War I. He was a messenger, so he had to basically deliver messages under heavy fire, and he did this with a lot of bravery. And that first class, the Iron Cross that he received, is something that he actually wore later into World War II, and it was one of the only medals that he really wore. Whereas Göring, for example, wore medals everywhere. So,
however, when an artillery shell injured his leg, he went back to Germany to recover and was outraged to find a general apathetic anti-war attitude among the exhausted and hungry German populace. With the war turning against Germany, he returned to the front lines, but was temporarily blinded by a British gas attack in 1918. A month later, still recovering in hospital, Hitler learned of Germany's defeat and surrender. The terms of the peace treaty were...
and he said later that was one of the worst days of his life. And you got to think, too, that with someone like Hitler, who was, this sort of bohemian, freewheeling type, that having that general sense of purpose, that general sense of camaraderie, that was probably something that deeply, he was probably deeply happy despite the war, going on and all the horrors of it. Sort of in my experience in the military as well, my continued experience in the military, is that that sense of camaraderie that you get is unlike anything. It's really quite, it really does quite have a bit of an impact
on Germany. It had to pay a lot of money and lose a lot of soldiers. These conditions
we talked about
this
during
and
the
Oversimplified
World War II video.
Europe's borders changed after the war too. New countries were formed out of Russia's lost territory. Austria-Hungary was dissolved, and there was one big new country splitting Germany into two.
And the World War I video.
Seeing the country he loved humiliated like this, said that hatred grew in him for those responsible, by which he meant communists and Jews, who he believed had stabbed Germany in the back by spreading dissent and anti-war propaganda back home.
Yeah, and this stab in the back theory was really popular too. This was not just some sort of fringe, super right-wing conspiracy. But the stab in the back theory was actually believed by a lot of the German sort of aristocrats and people in power, which Hitler would later exploit for his gain. Yeah, so that was a great video, just a great overview. It sort of paints Hitler as this sort of character that was sort of non-caring, not hardworking, but was deeply passionate about some of the things that he was really interested in. He was enrolled as a soldier in the war, and then when that all came crashing down, that was sort of like his purpose came crashing down. I don't know if they'll get into it in part 2, but then very briefly after this, he started working sort of as a spy, if you will, in the Freikorps, which was the sort of paramilitary wing of what was left of the government. And one of his tasks was to spy on the Deutsches Arbeitspartei, which is the forerunner to the Nationalsozialisten Deutsches Arbeitspartei, which is the NASDAP, which is the Nazi party. So perhaps we'll get into that into part 2, but hope you enjoyed the reaction. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. And yeah, if I got anything wrong, if you think maybe I have a wrong opinion on something, be sure to let me know. And I will see you guys in part 2, which I will also need to download in VLC because I can't watch it on YouTube. So kind of dumb. Anyways, see you guys then.